This is the theBreaker.news podcast for the week of June 12th, 2022. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.news and host of the theBreaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 242. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support The Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest, the Is It Just Me commentary, I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker, and the Big Deal feature, the long-awaited report by BC's coroner on the 2021 heat dome and the BC NDP government's new heat wave warning protocol. But if they followed the directions created by an Environment Canada meteorologist, they could have saved hundreds of lives. My guest is David Jones, the retired coastal warning preparedness meteorologist. But first, is it just me? Is it just me, or did the NDP government bury the report by the All-Party Committee to review BC's Freedom of Information and privacy laws? The Legislature Committee waited until the week after the close of the spring session to release the report. With the billion-dollar Royal BC Museum controversy still swirling, it was also the week when the post-mortem of last June's deadly heat dome was released. More on that in the Big Deal feature. So, the FOI Committee report didn't get the attention it deserved, especially after last fall's controversy over the NDP's Bill 22, which gutted the FOI law and imposed a $10 tax on each Freedom of Information request. In its report, the special committee, quote, recognized the frustration expressed by many with regard to the FOI system and is of the view that a fundamental shift toward a culture of increased transparency could alleviate many of these concerns and better serve British Columbians. Members agreed that the proactive disclosure of more information should be a key priority for public bodies. The MLAs recommended that the law be extended to cover the legislature, and that information held by public bodies be considered public by default and proactively released without undue delay. All nice words, but will there be any action? Sadly, the committee failed to reach consensus on a recommendation about the $10 tax that was imposed by the NDP government. How did that happen? One word, politics. The 8-member committee included 5 NDP backbenchers, 2 members from the BC Liberals and 1 from the Green Party. 3 of those 5 NDP members, almost half the committee, were rookies, too scared to question their masters, John Horgan and his chief of staff, Jeff Meggs. Meggs utterly despises the FOI law and the reporters that use it to tell the public what really goes on behind the scenes. What do you think? Email Bob at theBreaker.news. This is the Big Deal feature on the theBreaker.news podcast.
And essentially, people didn't take it as seriously as they thought, as we perhaps now think we should have taken it. And we're all guilty of that. You know, there was also some lag related to agencies that weren't ready. And that's what a lot of the work at the Death Review panel was about. Trying to work out a way that we can actually put alerts out there and actually get a cascade of events that then takes place from that alert, which will ensure that the deaths that we had last time around didn't occur. I mean, essentially, if you think about it, people dying from heat, it's a failure of the way that we live. It's not a failure of the health system, it's a failure of the way that we live. And it's the more burden we put on the health system at times like this, it's more of a surrogate of how badly we failed in the way that we're actually sort of planning our cities and our homes.
That was the voice of Dr. Jatinder Baidwan, Chief Medical Officer of the BC Coroner's Service. The NDP government and municipalities did not do enough to warn British Columbians of the record-breaking heat dome that enveloped the province late last June. The June 7th report from the BC Coroner's Service said 619 people suffered heat-related deaths from June 25th to July 1st of 2021. It was the worst natural disaster in Canadian history. More than 2/3 of victims were 70 or older, over half lived in poorer neighborhoods, and most had no air conditioning or fans. Ambulance dispatchers and paramedics were overwhelmed by the call volume, which doubled during the heat dome's peak. BC Emergency Health Services waited until June 29th to activate the Emergency Operations Centre. The key recommendation of the report was to establish a coordinated province-wide heat alert response system. BC Public Safety Minister Mike Farnworth.
Very much so. I mean, last year's heat dome was absolutely unprecedented. We had never seen anything like that in this province. And one of the important things is obviously to learn the lessons from that. And so that's why this announcement is today, in terms of our ability to be to have an alert system that not only takes into account that we are approaching a potential heat emergency by having the two-stage alert. So you've got the heat alert and then the extreme heat emergency. So those things are in place, but also working a lot more with local governments in terms of the identification of cooling centres, cooling stations. The province made it clear that we would be paying for the transportation to get people to cooling stations. Again, funding in place that will allow local governments being able to access to do mapping in terms of where the most vulnerable populations are, and so being able to be better prepared in terms of the provision of cooling stations, putting out information in numerous languages so that people have access for those whose English is not their first language, in terms of what services are available, what to do as we approach a heat emergency, how to stay cool. All of those things are in place. And as I said, I fully expect with the coroner's report there will be additional recommendations.
But BC already had a system to warn the public when it got way too hot.
It's been known since roughly 2010 that consecutive days of temperatures over 36 at Abbotsford would lead to death. That's on account of the research that was done after the deadly 2009 heat wave that went for 5 days, and we had excess temperatures over 36 degrees, and the science and evidence showed that there was a spike in mortality associated with that heat wave. And that's really what instigated the development of a heat alerting system that was unique in Canada. It may have been the only evidence-based, or one of the very few anyway, evidence-based weather warning systems in Canada. Sometime between when I retired in 2017 and 2021, that system seemed to have disappeared. When I realized how hot it was going to be, I started looking online for the protocols and the steps that were in that system. I couldn't find anything from anyone, and I was really surprised and confused.
That is the voice of David Jones, the former coastal warning preparedness meteorologist for Environment Canada's Pacific Storm Prediction Centre. In 2012, David Jones developed a new extreme heat warning protocol for BC that was prompted by the July 2009 heat wave. The two-step protocol that you brought in 2012 and what that would have done if it had been followed to the T in June of last year.
This project for a heat alerting system was instigated or initiated by the BC Centre for Disease Control and the Coastal Health Authority, Vancouver Coastal Health, and the Fraser Health Authority after that 2009 heat wave. So it was a project that they initiated, and of course they came to Environment Canada, and I was the lead at that point for those types of things with the Weather Service. So I was involved in that, and a system was set up based on the trigger of consecutive days of temperatures exceeding 36 degrees at Abbotsford, whereby there was a two-step process. Heads up was the first initial step, whereby 3, 4, 5 days in advance, typically the weather office can see these events coming. They are very predictable. Heat waves are very reliably predictable, and so we can alert for them 4 or 5 days in advance with confidence. The next step was, at that time, was only to be launched the day before. And part of the reason it was only launched the day before was to avoid the problem of over-alerting and being wrong about a very serious alert. So step 2 was the day before that threshold was to be reached, the weather office would contact the health authorities, and there would be a conference call. All of the health authorities within the Fraser Health and the Vancouver Coastal Health regions would get coordinated. We'd issue a warning at the Pacific Storm Prediction Center, and all the health authorities would kick their program into gear with watering stations, with cooling stations, with everything that's been done and can be done to mitigate extreme heat. So that was set up and operational by about 2011, 2012. And I retired in 2017, and we never had the opportunity to pull the trigger on the extreme or deadly heat alert before I retired. We got close a couple of times, but never quite got there. So that was personally disappointing, because I spent a lot of time trying to train the forecasters in the protocol and the steps that were to be taken. And then 2021 comes around, and we see this massive, absolutely perfect storm of intense heat coming at an extraordinarily unusual time. There's never been any heat close to this that early in the season. And so it would have been the perfect time to launch that deadly heat alert. Now, the alert itself was only for the coast, and that was a consequence of the researchers being unable to actually find a deadly heat threshold in the interior. And that's a consequence of the fact that people in the interior are better acclimatized to heat. There's more air conditioning and people are used to it. So the impact was invisible to the researchers, let's say. There just wasn't enough events. There's not a big enough population base for statistically these researchers to produce a reliable, evidence-based deadly heat threshold for the BC interior.
Environment Canada warned late June 23, 2021 of a damaging, long-lasting heat wave, but it took 2 more days until 5:30 p.m. on Friday, June 25, 2021, for the Vancouver and Fraser health officials to issue the extreme heat warning.
Well, I was contacted on holiday on the Saturday before, that record was set on Tuesday, but each day prior to that was, in addition, well above 36 degrees across the valley and through the interior. And it was apparent that this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. I mean, numerical models and our model output statistics to get techie on you were suggesting Lytton was going to hit 50 degrees. No one had ever seen anything close to that before. And that's very evident if you look at the statistical record, the past. This coming heat wave was off the chart. So I suspect what would have happened, Bob, in this case, if there had been consistency, if there had been the knowledge transfer between the health authorities, the BC Centre for Disease Control, and Environment Canada, the alert, the severe step 2 warning would have gone out much earlier, because there was such high confidence that we were in deep trouble. If you recall at the time, the desert southwest of the US, Oregon, Washington, as that massive warm air was moving up the west coast of the United States, they were setting all manner of all-time records. So a confidence in this particular forecast was going to be extremely high. And it's ironic that, the last time there was death due to weather was 2009. I mean, directly attributable to weather. Heat's unique in that sense, Bob. We issue warnings as weather forecasters for, all manner of weather situations. Most of the thresholds are somewhat arbitrary. Wind warning thresholds, snowfall warnings. Do we warn for 5, 10, 15, 20? When do we need to get people to light their hair on fire? This particular warning was really interesting because we knew that people were actually going to die. There's no other alerting system in weather where forecasters know people are going to die. Vulnerable people are going to die. So that makes this failure even greater, because this is one of those times that come along once in a lifetime, and meteorologists actually have an opportunity to prevent death. There's no other alert in weather where there's guaranteed death, and we can do something about it. So something went wrong. I'm not sure what. When I watched that conference, it seemed to me the coroner had been very poorly informed, or the people around him simply did not know much about the history of weather alerting here for extreme heat, and the fact that many levels of health authorities were involved in this since the deadly heat wave of 2009.
Weather forecasting about a week down the road has, because of technology and because of expertise, meteorologists are very good at showing us what's going to happen the next week. After that, not really at all. But in this case, there was also this loud clamor of especially politicians or people who are politicized to say there's climate change, and raise the alarm. As much as we do need to live lives that are more environmentally conscious and more frugal, leave less damage to the planet, there is also this other phenomenon which politicizes events like this, that gets in the way of actually preparing humans for events like this, and to make sure that humans are resilient as well. Talk about that, what that has done to the science of meteorology to politicize it, when you get this anxiety and this alarm that gets infused.
Sure. Well, I think everyone, experiences some undue and unnecessary anxiety in this case. When it comes to changes in global climate, there is so much misinformation out there that the reality of what's happening on the ground, say regionally, like here in BC, which really is the only thing I'm concerned about. That's where my expertise in weather lies. So if you want to talk about global trends, great. I mean, that's important. But to me here in BC, Bob, that's like telling me the temperature in Canada today is 10. To say that there's going to be an increase in flooding, which the IPCC does not declare, on a global scale, what does that mean to me here in BC? I want to know what's happening on the ground here in BC. So there's plenty of misinformation out there. And with respect to heat wave, it's the same. If you look at trends in extreme deadly heat waves at Abbotsford, you won't find one from the 50s to 2020. And if you look at what happened in 2021, that event is so far off the charts. It's literally off the charts. It's a black swan event and will probably never happen again in my lifetime, and might not happen for hundreds of years from now. It's just so extraordinary. So to claim that was climate change, you simply can't do. It's weather. Okay, the alerting is done for weather. It's not done for climate. There's a popular term now called a climate event. I have no idea what that is. Climate is an abstraction of sorts. It's means and averages. It's the average of the weather and the extremes at either end, so the outliers. So to say that a climate event is something that's an abstraction on an abstraction. And that's commonly what's done here. And you're seeing locally people who really don't know anything about weather stepping up and declaring that these heat waves and other events are going to be occurring more frequently, and we need to prepare for them. The truth is, we just need to prepare for the weather, because these events, most of them have happened before. And there's nothing that's changed in the physics of the atmosphere to suggest that windstorms, snowstorms, rainstorms, anything of that particular type here in BC has changed, except the temperature. So the temperature on average is rising. And about the only impact a forecaster can see that on meteorology here on the West Coast is to say that, seems like the Arctic air is not getting as cold as it used to. When I started my career at the Weather Office in 1988, we had typically very cold Arctic outbreaks that were not uncommon to reach -12, -15 here on the South Coast. We just don't see that anymore, although we got very close, interestingly, in the last couple of years here to one of those events. So, the temperature's rising, but as far as we can tell, in terms of the weather, that's the only thing that's happening. There's no great increase in windstorms. Forecasters are not changing the processes they have in the Weather Office to adopt something that's necessary because of a new climate. This is all, it's overreach by people who are not experienced operational meteorologists here in BC, who tend to be a bunch of retired guys like me. I'm not alone in this, believe me.
That was my guest, meteorologist David Jones, former coastal warning preparedness meteorologist of the Environment Canada Pacific Storm Prediction Center. You can find his weather forecasts and analysis on Instagram or YouTube. Just look for meteorologist David Jones, the Powder Preacher. Now it's time on the theBreaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In the Taiwan news, Slovakian lawmakers pretend to brawl in Taiwan legislature. Having watched international news reports about skirmishes in the Legislative Yuan, the president of Bratislava region, Jurij Droba, and Slovakian parliamentarian Miroslav Ziak staged a simulated scuffle for the cameras. DPP lawmaker Ho Chi Wei then jumped in to demonstrate how he would attempt to persuade the two parties to cool down during such a melee. Meanwhile, a Taiwanese fisherman caught a massive oarfish over 6 meters in length and weighing 130 kilograms near Taitung County on June 9th. The Russell's oarfish is known in Taiwan as the Dragon Palace Messenger or earthquake fish. In the Hong Kong Free Press, Hong Kong investigative news platform FactWire disbands, fourth outlet to shutter in under a year. Founded in 2015, FactWire was a crowd-funded bilingual news outlet that conducted deep dives into local affairs, often breaking stories later picked up by media and prompting responses from the government. The disbandment comes weeks after it reported on the Chinese business links of Chief Executive-elect John Lee's sons, and just over a month after it said its subscriber data had been hacked. FactWire's closure follows the shutdown of Apple Daily, Stand News, and Citizen News, which all folded under pressure from authorities. In Kyoto News, Japan ruling lawmaker in hot seat over alleged drinking with teenage girl. The Weekly Post magazine said in its latest edition that Takeru Yoshikawa, 40, had dinner and alcoholic drinks with an 18-year-old female university student at a Japanese barbecue restaurant in Tokyo on the night of May 27th, and he paid her $300. The drinking age in Japan is 20. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In the Oregonian, Portland man who was struck by truck while directing traffic away from protest marchers sues city alleging police failed to investigate. Richard Bunch was wearing a bright green vest with the word Solidarity on the back above an image of a fist. A truck hauling a trailer hit him about 10 p.m. on June 17, 2020, the lawsuit said. A witness described Bunch grabbing onto the truck when it wouldn't go where he wanted it to, according to a police report. He suffered compound leg fractures. The 43-year-old seeks $790,000 in damages, including at least $185,000 for medical costs. In the Seattle Times, Seattle pays $500,000 to settle lawsuit over a man's death in CHOP shooting. The lawsuit alleged the city and those leaders encouraged participants in the so-called CHOP, the Capitol Hill occupied protest, to break the law and undermine the safety of others for political theater. Horace Anderson and the estate of his dead son, Horace Lorenzo Anderson, filed the complaint in King County Superior Court in November 2021, naming as defendants former Mayor Jenny Durkin, Councilmember Kashama Sawant, and the City of Seattle. In Czech news, no water and no power, Ukrainian safe haven falls victim to $25,000 in break-in damages. Brian Hollowaychuk says he's put in more than $1 million toward renovation costs and other expenses. Thieves broke in and took tools and copper wiring from the former Grouse Nest Resort. He currently houses 8 refugees and is working alongside them to create a community within his property, including offering communal spaces, activities, and on-site English lessons. Hollowaychuk says he's expecting a handful more refugees next week and wants to reach a total of around 100. That's Cascadia Calling on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast.
Don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone, you won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to the 4 women who had the strength to tell police about the crimes committed against them by their former coach, Bob Berarda. Berarda was in court on June 8th for the start of his sentencing hearing. The Crown wants 2 years less a day in jail for Berarda, who pleaded guilty to sexual assault. He is a former national team soccer coach and coach of the Whitecaps women's team. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of June 12th, 2022. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 12th of June in 1987 at the Brandenburg Gate by the Berlin Wall, Ronald Reagan's famous challenge to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. For news as it happens, follow The Breaker News on Twitter and visit theBreaker.news on Facebook. You can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/thebreakernews. That's patreon.com/thebreakernews. Until next week.